Good morning, and welcome to Coffee with Bob. Now, I don't know if you have Amazon Prime Video, but there's a great documentary that I highly recommend. Now, it's probably not a surprise that I would watch this one. I love documentaries, but as soon as I saw the title of this one, of course I had to watch it. It's called John Wesley, The Faith That Sparked the Methodist Movement. Now, I am enough of a Methodist nerd to admit that I am glad to watch a Methodist documentary on my day off. I highly recommend it to you. It's a great production, and it's only 51 minutes long, not even an hour. That's shorter than one of mine and Dr. Long's Wednesday Night Alive classes. Watch it. You'll probably learn some new things. John Wesley was a fascinating person. He was someone who rode over 250,000 miles on horseback. And all the while he would be reading books while he was riding to make the most of his time, because he was dedicated to hard work, to piety, to mission, and to making the most of every moment and resource he had while he was alive. He was someone who preached over 40,000 times in his life. He was a person that, by the time of his death, had over 132,000 followers in the Methodist movement. And he wrote one of England's most popular medical books, or book on health. It was entitled The Primitive Physic, and it went through 32 editions. But even as incredible as all those things were, the thing that really impresses me about John Wesley was his ability to change and adapt for God. All of us have trouble with change unless we are the ones bringing it about. If we are causing change, then we have gotten ourselves to the point that either because we didn't like something, we're ready for something new, or because we have been getting ready for a new direction. If we're the author of change, usually it's a little easier pill for us to swallow. But if it's change imposed upon us, most of us struggle with it. It doesn't feel good. Spontaneity is something that usually is, again, of our own accord. We can all be spontaneous. That, I think I'll go out to eat tonight, or I'll plan an off-the-cuff vacation. Those are things, again, that are under our control, and usually planning something fun and spontaneous. But we're in charge. John Wesley was someone who was not spontaneous. There was a reason he earned the term methodical, Methodist. He liked routine and tradition. He liked doing the same things at the same time. And so for him to change in response to how he saw God's work in the world, to me, I find that impressive, because he was someone who was rigid. Again, an incredible person, not perfect. I certainly wouldn't want anyone to seek his advice for his relationship with a special someone. He had terrible relationships with women. But he was someone that, because of his quirky personality, because he really was somebody who was so methodical, I find it impressive that he could give way to what he saw God's work doing in the world. For example, he was someone who didn't believe in the laity preaching. He had gone through all the steps that the Church of England required of him, all the education and everything he had to accomplish to be able to enter into the priesthood of the Anglican Church. And so he thought that was a good way to prepare someone to preach, until his mother reminded him, his mother Susanna, who was incredibly influential in his life, his mother Susanna reminded him that if there was a lay person who preached and showed positive results, in other words, that people responded to the preaching and grew closer to God because of it, who was John Wesley to deny what was happening or deny them the pulpit? And so from somebody who was so rigid, these are the steps in order for you to preach, John Wesley would give way to someone he saw preaching that it was obvious produced results. Another well-known example is that John Wesley believed people were designed to come to God inside a church building, that it would happen in that preaching moment in a sanctuary. And in the Anglican Church, it was very formal. They would wear official robe, and they would have usually an elevated pulpit, and it was very strict, regimented. It was methodical. And yet, the way that the church operated at that time really put up barriers for some to be able to attend. Pews were rented, and if a person couldn't afford a pew, they could stand somewhere else. But not only did that affect the lives of the poor who couldn't afford to rent a pew, they also felt that they stood out, not only by standing up, but also because of their clothing. They couldn't dress as nice as others. And so the poor, for different reasons, really had to endure the barriers that the church, the way that it operated. Many of the poor just stopped going. George Whitefield, who was a contemporary and a friend of John Wesley's, introduced John to outdoor preaching. Now again, John Wesley believed, well, you should hear the word of God in church, from an elevated pulpit, from a preacher who had gone through all the steps. But George Whitefield took him to this field preaching. Now, not preaching in the middle of a field of waving wheat. It was preaching to the miners in the area where they were mining, and it was dangerous, difficult work that the miners went through. The average age, lifespan of a person that was working in the mines was just 30 years old. And they would employ family members, children. It was tremendously difficult. George Whitefield brought John Wesley to this dirty, ragtag area full of people who probably didn't know how to follow the ritual behaviors in church because they weren't attending. And they weren't dressed neat and nice, and they were coarse in their habits and their language. And John Wesley saw the effects of George Whitefield's preaching. And so everything that would go against what John Wesley believed, he couldn't deny seeing the way that God was working in these people's lives, that they were coming to Christ by preaching outdoors. And so he was willing to leave all of these certitudes behind to follow God. John Wesley was opinionated, methodical, disciplined, and yet he would follow the way God worked in the world. He would give way to the way God worked in the world. He yielded to God's movement. And that opened the door for countless number of people over the centuries to come to know Christ through John Wesley and the Methodist movement. What are the things that you and I hold on to, our opinions, that can sometimes get in the way of a person's relationship with God? How is it that we can be opinionated and methodical and disciplined? And probably nobody was more so than John Wesley. But if he could yield to what he saw God doing in the world, how much more can we? It's what we're called to do, to not only follow Christ, but yield to Christ's ministry in the world so that the results can be magnified. Today, spend some time thinking about how you can always make sure to leave that door a little bit open. Of course, we'll all have opinions and beliefs, but we need to make sure we leave the door open to be able to respond and yield to the way God is working in the world. Our beliefs can't be against God's work. If we find our beliefs and our thoughts at an odds with what God is doing in the world, we need to give way. And it will be our joy to be there as those results are made known, as the harvest comes in. I hope you have a great day today.